someone says, "I'm setting a boundary," the room changes. Not because the boundary is wrong, because suddenly the conversation feels clinically settled. A minute ago, this was a messy disagreement. Now it sounds like one person has a diagnosis and the other has a moral failing. That shift is the story of therapy speak. Not a joke, not a panic, a language migration with real psychological consequences. The American Psychological Association described therapy speak as double-edged. Less stigma, richer emotional vocabulary, but also more misuse and relational division. The problem is not that people learn psychological words. The problem is what happens when those words stop opening experience and start closing it. Think of a friend saying, "You're gaslighting me," when you remember the conversation differently. Your stomach drops. The dispute has changed categories. In 2025, Carme Azernmaz and Manuel Almagro defined therapy speak as psychotherapy language used superficially outside its intended scope. That definition matters because words carry rooms with them. A word born in therapy can bring therapy's authority into a kitchen argument. Psychologist Lisa Tamor told the APA the root is often a wish to understand intense or unfamiliar emotions. That wish deserves respect. A name can turn private confusion into something shareable. It can make pain less lonely. APA cited research on rap lyrics from 1998 to 2018. Mental health metaphors rose from 8% to 44%. Popular culture did not invent suffering. It gave suffering a public vocabulary. And once language goes public, it changes shape. At work, someone says a manager is narcissistic because they dominate meetings. Maybe they are harmful. Maybe they are just arrogant. Azernmaz and Almagro argue therapy speak can encourage pathologizing, self-diagnosis, and using clinical authority to discredit other people. This is the seductive part. Clinical words can make uncertainty feel finished. They turn, "I don't know what happened," into "I know who you are." One approach may help before using the label. Name the behavior. Not gaslighting. Try, "You denied saying something I clearly remember." APA notes online mental health vocabulary can help people find community, especially around neurodivergence, while misinformation can blur important distinctions. So the story cannot be everyone should stop saying these words. Some people found themselves because these words existed. In dating, "I'm protecting my peace" can mean real self-respect. It can also mean, "I don't want to explain why I disappeared." The 2025 paper warns therapy speak may be weaponized to evade responsibility, avoid dialogue, or frame ordinary disagreement as pathology. Softly, the psychological danger is moral outsourcing. Instead of saying, "I can't tolerate this," we say, "Your behavior is inherently toxic." A boundary describes what you will do to protect yourself. A demand describes what another person must do to manage your discomfort. Taisha Caldwell Harvey told APA, "I love it and I hate it," capturing how many clinicians see therapy speak now. That ambivalence feels right. The same phrase can help someone leave harm or help someone avoid the discomfort of being questioned. Azernmaz and Almagro emphasize that therapy speak uses psychotherapy terms for experiences that fall outside those terms' intended scope. Gaslighting once named a specific pattern, manipulating someone into doubting reality. Now it often means, "You remember this differently than I do." Consider asking, "What happened specifically?" That question doesn't dismiss harm, it slows the leap from pain to verdict. Labels are maps. Useful maps simplify. Dangerous maps pretend the simplification is the territory itself. A trigger can name a real involuntary reaction. It can also become a way to say, "I should never feel challenged." AP cautions that misinformation can distort the line between ordinary distress and clinical disorder, especially in fast-moving online spaces. That line is not always obvious. Ordinary distress can feel enormous from the inside. Clinical disorder can be invisible from the outside. If you feel activated, consider saying, "I need a pause," before saying, "You triggered me." The first sentence leaves room. Emotional labor once described managed feeling in paid service work. Now it can mean any exhausting care we don't want to provide. APA's overview notes the upside clearly. Therapy speak reflects reduced stigma and more willingness to talk about mental health. A culture that can say depression aloud is different from one that only says lazy or difficult. That difference matters. But watch what happens when a coworker's bluntness becomes abuse or a friend's forgetfulness becomes attachment trauma in one sentence. The 2025 analysis argues that imprecise clinical language can erode the meaning of the very terms people rely on. The more precise sentence may be less dramatic. When you interrupted me, I felt dismissed. It is also harder to hide behind. Why do the bigger words feel better? Because they protect us from the embarrassment of wanting something ordinary: attention, apology, tenderness. Small pause. It can feel safer to accuse someone of violating a psychological principle than to admit, "I wanted you to call." If this kind of careful language helps you think, a gentle like or subscription helps more listeners find these conversations. At a family table, one person says, "This is my trauma response." Everyone freezes. Nobody knows whether to comfort, apologize, or disagree. The 2025 paper is not a clinical trial. It is an ethical and philosophical analysis of how language shapes knowledge and responsibility. That limitation is important. We are not measuring how every person uses these words. We are asking what the words make easier. A useful test: does this term make you more curious about the other person or more certain you no longer need curiosity? When language expands curiosity, it clarifies. When it ends curiosity, it hardens. That is how a boundary becomes a wall. Conflict already narrows perception. We scan for threat, gather evidence, rehearse our defense. Therapy speak can intensify that narrowing. Abe Tiwe describes many therapy terms moving through social media, workplaces, friendships, and dating, often far from professional context. One practical structure may help: hurt, request, consequence. That hurt me. Please don't joke about it. If it continues, I'll leave. Notice the difference. I'm hurt invites repair. You are harmful asks the other person to defend their entire character. APA's article encourages harnessing therapy speak's power while helping people use terms accurately, especially when misconceptions spread online. Ask yourself, am I describing a pattern, or am I using a serious word for one painful moment? Narcissist is especially tempting because it gives a story to inconsiderate behavior. But not every self-centered person has a disorder. APAP notes terms like narcissism, trauma, triggers, and gaslighting now appear widely in casual conversation and online commentary. Consider trying the smaller claim first. That felt self-centered. It leaves room for surprise, apology, and new information. Trauma language has a similar tension. It can validate survival. It can also make every painful memory sound clinically equivalent. Iser and Moss and Alma Groh warn that broad, imprecise use can dilute clinical meanings and make communication less accurate. When every wound gets the largest word available, smaller distinctions disappear. Regret, disappointment, fear, embarrassment, and grief all become one gray mass. Then comes the phrase, "You violated my boundary." Sometimes that is exactly true. Sometimes it means you didn't do what I preferred. A boundary names your action. If this conversation turns insulting, I will step away. It is not a remote control for another person. Repair requires something less glamorous than diagnosis. It requires describing impact without pretending we can see perfectly into motive. APA frames the cultural shift as both promising and risky, better language for distress but also more confusion when terms travel too far. That is probably the honest position. Therapy speak is not ruining relationships by itself. It is revealing how hungry we are for authority. Before the label, consider one breath and one concrete sentence. Here is what happened. Here is how it landed. Conflict needs precision because people change in specifics. Nobody repairs toxic. They repair yesterday's sentence, last week's silence, this morning's joke. The awkward sentence is often the truest one. I felt disposable when you canceled again. Not clinical. Just vulnerable. Try the formula when you can. When you did this, I felt this, and I need this now. It may not solve everything. The 2025 authors call the risks epistemic and ethical. Therapy speak can change what people believe they know about themselves and others. Quietly, that is why the question is not whether these words are good or bad. The question is whether they keep us honest. Treat therapy terms as hypotheses, not verdicts. Maybe this is a boundary issue keeps the door open longer than you crossed my boundary. The next time a clinical word rises in your mouth, pause. Ask whether it is helping you describe reality or helping you escape it. Because the best psychological language does not make us less responsible for conflict, it makes us more precise inside it.